Jesus loved a good story. Reading the Gospels, it often looks like he just came up with them there and then. But I wonder if he actually worked at them, like a good preacher deciding on the point that he wanted to make, working out each story carefully so that the point he was making was made as effectively as possible. Some of Jesus' stories have become very familiar indeed, familiar both to churchgoers and non-churchgoers alike. Stories like the Good Samaritan, which tells of a stranger showing kindness to a man who had been mugged. That story has become so familiar, or perhaps to put it another way, it has been so effective, that we have lost the sense that it is surprising. Of course you should help an injured person. What decent woman or man would not do that? The story, though, that we've heard from the Gospels this morning, which Margaret read just a minute or two ago, is perhaps less familiar. And I don't think it has lost its capacity to surprise. Like so many of Jesus' stories, it has a twist, something which catches our attention. Like so many of Jesus' stories, it takes an ordinary situation and makes us question some basic assumptions. And at the same time, it uses something familiar to teach us about the kingdom of God. Workers hired by the day were common in Jesus' time. They were, I suppose, the people of their day on 0 hours contracts. Every day they had to go out and look for work. Some days they'd find it. On the days they didn't, they and their families went hungry. A day's pay, a denarius, covered no more than a day's modest expenses, just enough to eat. Jesus tells a story about a landowner. He needed people to work in his vineyard. So he goes to the marketplace and he hires some workers. Several times in the day he goes back to hire more. And at the end of the day he pays them, starting with those he hired last. To each he gives the same amount of money, a denarius, a small coin. The people at the back of the queue for payment, the people who had been working from first thing in the morning, are outraged by this. But listen carefully to what they said. They said, "You have made them equal to us. You have made them, the ones that only came an hour ago, equal to those of us who've been working all day in the heat." That's what they really objected to. They objected to the equality. Now imagine that the queue had been the other way round. That those who had worked the longest, the ones who had been hired first, stood at the front. They'd have been paid their denarius, and they would have gone away with no idea of the landowner's intentions. They would have been content that they had been paid the price that they had agreed for their day's work. The people who'd come late, those who'd been hired at the 9th and the 11th hour, they would have been the ones taken by surprise. And they might have said, "You have made us equal to them?" But it wouldn't have been a complaint. They wouldn't have been grumbling. They'd have said that with some wonder and probably some delight. Had Jesus told that subtly different story, it would have been a story of surprising generosity. But he didn't tell that story. The story he told was about grace. It was about justice. It was about equality. And it's also a story deeply critical of human nature, a story which makes us question our belief in what it is we deserve. We live in a society in which pay is claimed to represent the different value of different occupations. But we know it very often misrepresents the true worth of particular jobs to society. Pay is used to stratify, to denote seniority, responsibility, skill levels, required qualifications. So some people end up being paid a very great deal, and others very little. We do often, I know, question this. We question it when we ask, for example, why should professional footballers, whose job is really just to entertain by playing football in front of crowds, why are they paid so much? When, to take another example, an example that might be close to the hearts of some of us who are here today, soldiers, why are they paid so little? When their job is to defend the integrity and the peace of the country. But while we might question the different values placed on different work, I think we rarely, if ever, question the basic assumption which underlies this system. The assumption that pay should be a reflection of value. But in telling this story, Jesus was questioning that basic assumption, or at least that's where he starts from. In this story, he talks of pay which meets needs, rather than pay which signifies status or value. He talks of pay which equalizes, which should unite, rather than the system that we all accept, even while we're grumbling about it, the system which divides and creates inequality. The people in the story who'd worked the whole day were outraged by the idea that their status as those who had come first and done the most work was being devalued. Receiving recognition that they had worked the longest mattered more to them than the hunger of another worker's children. The vineyard owner, however, chose to provide for the daily need of all his workers, those who'd been there 12 hours and those who'd been there only one. Was he being generous? In a way, yes. But we would only really, I suppose, answer that he was being generous if we remain fixed on the idea that pay should represent differential values. And so we could say that he was being generous to those who'd only worked for an hour. But overall, since the landowner's interest was in providing for the needs of those who had worked, for all of those who had worked, he was not being particularly generous at all. A wealthy man, he only gave the workers just enough to get through the next day. It might be helpful at this point to think back to our Old Testament reading. You'll remember the Israelites are in the wilderness, a place where food is scarce, they're hungry, and they're grumbling, and they complain to Moses, who has led them there. And Moses prays to God. A solution is provided. God provides food. Quail in the evening, manna in the morning. Apart from the common thread of grumbling, which runs through both of these stories, the key similarity between the story of the Israelites in the wilderness and the story of the vineyard workers is this: it is in the provision of enough. Not too much, not too little, just enough. In the Old Testament story, God provides food every day. There's enough for everyone, but except on the evening of the Sabbath, it cannot be stored. No one gets more than they need, and no one can hoard what they receive. And this idea of being given enough, not too much and not too little, is something we see in other biblical stories too. For example, when Jesus fed 5,000 people, everyone had enough to satisfy them. No one had too much, and no one too little. There's a theme here, a pattern emerging. And it's a pattern radically different from the way that we are used to wealth and resources being distributed. What Jesus is saying is that what matters is that everyone has enough. Part of the genius of Jesus' storytelling is that his stories work on several levels. If what we take from this story is the message that everyone deserves enough, that would be good. Especially if it spurred us on to make sure that we were doing what we could to see that everyone has enough. If we take from this story the message that equality is something to be sought after, not a threat to our own privilege to be resented, then that would be better. And best of all would be for us to hear in this story the truth that God's sense of fairness is so much more fully developed than ours is. To hear in this story God's concern that the need, though not the desires, of all should be met. To hear in this story that this is how God treats all people, loving all, caring for all, providing enough for all. Now, if we are wondering why this doesn't seem to work, why some have so much, far more than they could ever need or use, and others have far too little, then perhaps we should listen to hear if our voices are among those of the workers who said, it's not fair. You have made them equal to us. And if we hear ourselves in these voices, it is time to recalibrate our flawed notions of justice and to embrace in our own hearts and lives and actions God's radical equality. Amen.